Okay, thank you, Mele. And if you have questions about Mele's talk, unfortunately, Mele was not able to attend, but perhaps Holger can help with some of that or at the end of his talk. So let me begin now by introducing Holger Droessler, who is an assistant professor of history at WPI. He's an historian of 19th and 20th century US history, with a special focus on imperialism, capitalism, and the Pacific Ocean. In his book, Coconut Colonialism, Workers and the Globalization of Samoa, to be published by Harvard University Press in December 2021, he argues that globalization of Samoa at the turn of the 20th century was driven by a diverse group of working people on and off the islands. He has published articles on copra plantations in German Samoa, on US naval strategy in American Samoa, and an Oceanian intellectual, Epele Haufa, as well. So without further ado, let me welcome Holger Droessler for our second keynote.
Manoia Leaso, good evening in Worcester and good morning in New Zealand. Into the future, I want to thank, before I start, my colleagues and organizers. I want to thank Mele Wendt, who could unfortunately not be with us, but really set the beautiful tone for our conversations today. And I also want to thank all the my fellow panelists and attendees to join us tonight here in Worcester, at least, and from around the world, to think about Oceania and WPI's relationship with the region. First off, I wanted to recognize and honor the deep genealogies and shared pasts that inform the present of islanders in Oceania and beyond. As a German-born historian, often in the United States, I'm aware of the role that these countries played in colonizing the Pacific. I see my research and teaching as a lifelong effort to engage with these complicated histories. So this is really what drives me, and I hope to give you a little bit of a slice of what I'm interested in and open up conversations about the history of Oceania as it informs the present. My talk today will take about 20 minutes and has 4 parts. So I'll give you a little bit of a roadmap of what I wanted to talk about. First, I wanted to give you an overview of the human settlement of Oceania and the Pacific Ocean that Mele already referred to briefly. I wanted to show you a map and explain this awesome feat in human history, the settlement of the Pacific Ocean. Second, I wanted to talk about one model intellectual of Oceania, namely Epele Haufa, that Mike already mentioned in the introduction. I published a little piece on him. So I wanted to draw on that to introduce you to this amazing intellectual. Passed away over 10 years ago, but was one of the most influential people thinking about Oceania, together with Mele's dad, actually, Albert Wendt, the famous Samoan author. Then third, I wanted to talk about the University of the South Pacific, where Haufa and many other leaders of the region have taught over the years. And I see potential connections between WPI and the USP, the University of the South Pacific. And then finally, I wanted to end with a few brief remarks on the future outlook of the region, really following up on what Mele was saying about that topic. All right, next slide, please. Thanks. So this is the overview map of Oceania. Mele talked about Moana Nui, the Great Ocean, in various Polynesian languages, Levasa Pacifica, the Samoan transliteration. It's mostly known as the Pacific Ocean for the rest of the world, named by Ferdinand Magellan in the early 16th century, the first European to circumnavigate the world and actually cartograph the Pacific Ocean quite a long time ago, 500 years ago. And he gave that name to the Pacific Ocean. A few stats on this, based on this map. The Pacific Ocean encompasses around 64 million square miles. By comparison, the United States has 3.8 million square miles. So almost 15 or 16 times as large as the United States territory. The Pacific Ocean also has almost half of the world's water surface. So half of the water on our planet is the Pacific Ocean. And in terms of overall surface area, it makes up a third of our planet. The Pacific Ocean is so large, it's larger than all land masses combined. So if you combine all continents and all islands, including Pacific Islands, the Pacific Ocean is bigger than that. So that's just to give you a sense of the dimensions we're talking about. I think it's very difficult to imagine, especially if you're in a landlocked place like Worcester. We're not far away from another ocean, but if you grew up on the Pacific Island or close to the Pacific Ocean, you have a different appreciation for these dimensions. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of the history of that region. All right, next slide, please. So this is a map of the settlement of Oceania and the Pacific Ocean. I hope you can see at least the larger contours of this map. And it's really one of the most amazing chapters in human history. The first time I learned about this in grad school, I was just awestruck by the engineering navigational feats of the ancestors of Pacific Islanders to be able to navigate through this huge ocean, find islands, settle there, and continue on. Here's a little bit of an overview of how that happened. So the ancestors of Pacific Islanders are called Austronesians. This is also a language family, the Austronesian language family. And these people spread from Southeast Asia in the northwest of this map, all the way to Madagascar on the western rim of the Indian Ocean, not on this map, and then all the way to the east to Rapa Nui that Mele already referred to, Easter Island. And that happened in 4 major waves. You see this reflected in different colors on the map. The first wave in yellow in the western part is quite old, very ancient, reaching back to 50 to 40,000 years BCE, before the Common Era. So over 50,000 years ago is when the first Austronesians moved from Southeast Asia across water routes in Southeast Asia to Greater Australia. Archaeologists call this larger Australia also Sahul, because sea levels were lower. The distance between what's today Indonesia and Australia were actually shorter, so it was a bit easier to get over there. And this is the original settlement of the indigenous peoples of Australia. So very old story. And at around the same time, a little bit later, 30,000 BCE, about 10,000 years later, 20,000 years later, the same Austronesians move a little bit further east in the north to what's today Papua New Guinea and the Solomons. That's the other yellow arrow on the map. So that's the first big wave. The second wave in orange comes from further north in Asia, probably from what's today Taiwan and the Philippines, around 3000 BCE. So this is 28,000 years later, with a large sort of break in between. 3000 BCE, much more recently, Austronesians moved from Taiwan through the Philippines and Southeast Asia, west to Madagascar, as I mentioned, and then east, represented on the map. They reached Papua New Guinea, where other people had already moved much earlier, around 1500 BCE, so over 4,000 years ago. So that's the orange map, the orange arrows. And that's just quite fascinating to think about. If you know about Taiwan, around 15% of the Taiwanese population are indigenous, and DNA studies and linguistic studies have traced connections between most Pacific Islanders and the indigenous peoples of Taiwan, and also the Philippines, where they had migrated to. So this is where most islanders actually come from, in all likelihood. Then the third wave, in red, comes in 2 directions, or 2 frequencies. One into Polynesia that continues this orange arrow just earlier. So the red smaller arrows in the middle of the map show you further migration east into Polynesia around 1000 BCE, so 3000 years ago, into Vanuatu and New Caledonia. That's sort of in the center of the map, there's a French map. So Nouvelle-Calédonie, the still French colony today, is represented there. A little bit later, around 950 BCE, the Austronesian seafarers reach Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. And that's would become the center of Polynesia and the Polynesian Triangle. There, they take a break. There's a longer break in these migration patterns for at least 1,000 years. And archaeologists and historians, as you can imagine, have been struggling to sort of make sense of that. Why has that happened? There's all kinds of theories about it: environmental crises, political competition, cultural changes were all candidates to explain that. But we don't really know. What's clear is that it took a while actually to settle the rest of Polynesia. And that's only the fourth wave then in purple. At the same time as Austronesians were moving into what would become Polynesia, they also moved into Micronesia. And that's the other red arrow further in the north, coming from Southeast Asia, Taiwan, just east into Micronesia. Around the same time, 1,500,000 BCE, into what's today the Mariana Islands, Palau, Guam, Yap, and then further east to the eastern fringes of Micronesia. And they reached that at the beginning of the Common Era, so 2,020 years ago. Eastern Micronesia, which is today the Republic of the Marshall Islands and Kiribati. And then finally, bear with me, the fourth wave, which fills out the corners of the so-called Polynesian Triangle, reaching from Hawaii in the north to Rapa Nui in the east and Aotearoa, New Zealand in the southwest. So Polynesians coming from that center, from Samoa, Fiji, Tonga, move further east at the beginning of the Common Era in the first few centuries to the Marquesas, which is today mostly of French Polynesia. And then in 800 CE, so just 1,200 years ago, they reach Hawaii in the north, which is a long distance voyage. 1200 CE, they reach Rapa Nui in Easter Island, which is much further east from the Marquesas, so also quite a large voyage. And then finally, they reach Aotearoa, New Zealand, the last part of Polynesia to be settled and one of the last parts in the world to be settled by humans, excepting Antarctica. Madagascar and Aotearoa are sort of the last places that humans settle. And that's around 1250 CE, so relatively recent. At the same time as, say, Leif Erikson reaches, Newfoundland during the Middle Ages in Europe, so to speak. All right. I'm happy to answer questions about this fascinating map, I think, later on. Overall, Pacific Islanders are rightfully proud of the accomplishments of their ancestors. I mean, look at this map and the distances that I mentioned. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles in Micronesia, for example. These long arrows are not to scale, but still, they give you a sense of the dimensions of some of these individual voyages. And Pacific Islanders, Oceanians, keep this legacy alive. There was a widespread cultural renaissance in the 1960s and 1970s, centered in Hawaii and in Micronesia, that was intended partly to show the world that this was not an accidental project, the settlement of the Pacific, but a quite intentional one, and one that was deeply embedded in the cultures of Pacific Islander navigation techniques. One of the leading voices of Oceania that was engaged in this cultural renaissance is Epeli Hauofa. And I wanted to spend some time talking about this amazing Oceanian intellectual now in my talk. So next slide, please. This is an image of Hauofa, who passed away around over 10 years ago now. But his spirit and his words are still very much with us. So I wanted to give you an overview of his life, his thinking, and what it might help us to do and to think through today. Epeli Hauofa was a Tongan Fijian activist, writer, and scholar. He was born to Tongan missionaries in the Australian-administered territory of Papua in 1939, where he attended school in Papua, in Tonga, and also in Fiji before doing his graduate work in Australia. From the early 1980s until his passing in 2009, he taught sociology and anthropology at the University of the South Pacific in Suva, Fiji. Crisscrossing the Pacific in both life and work, Hau'ofa became one of its most prominent advocates. To many scholars of the Pacific, he's best known for his essay, Our Sea of Islands, first published in 1993. In this much-cited piece, Hau'ofa criticized the long and fraught history of outlanders belittling Pacific islands and their peoples, and thus robbing them of control over their future. Stressing the power of Pacific traditions, Hau'ofa argued that there's, quote, a world of difference between viewing the Pacific as islands in a far sea and as a sea of islands, unquote. Oceanians, and that's Hau'ofa's preferred term, have long thought of themselves as ocean peoples whose shared home, the Pacific Ocean, connected them through ancestral myths, seafaring, and trade. It was only when continental men from Europe and North America came to the Pacific that this interdependent sea of islands came to be reduced to islands in a far sea. This is what Hau'ofa is arguing in that essay. The long-term effects of this symbolic and often very material violence on Oceania and its peoples, he noted, were still visible in contemporary debates about the political, economic, and environmental future of the region. For Hau'ofa, smallness is a state of mind and needed to be overcome to achieve a more self-determined future for Oceania. He concluded his essay by proclaiming, and I quote, "We are the ocean. We are the sea. We must wake up to this ancient truth and together use it to overturn all hegemonic views that aim ultimately to confine us again, physically and psychologically, in the tiny spaces that we have resisted accepting as our soul-appointed places, and from which we have recently liberated ourselves," unquote. For him, decolonization of Oceanian minds was far from complete with the achievement of political independence. Ultimately, the rebirth of Oceania would begin with the rediscovery of its rich communal past. Hau'ofa's powerful call for solidarity and its lucid presentation in several speeches reverberated across the region. Many Pacific islands had gained their formal independence between the 1960s and 1980s. From Western Samoa in 1962, very proud there, Tonga and Fiji in 1970, to Vanuatu in 1980. But long-established political and economic dependencies were harder to leave behind. Economic advisors, non-governmental activists, and government officials from the West descended on the Pacific to help, quote unquote, develop the region. And this resonates with what Mele's dad, Albert Wendt, was saying in the 1970s. It was in this context that Hau'ofa's essay intervened with a powerful call for oceanic solidarity based on a proud history of inter-island exchange. He repeated and refined his argument in other essays and soon matched his rhetoric with institution building. After complicated negotiations with university administrators and donors, the Oceania Center for Arts and Culture opened under his leadership at the USP in Suva in Fiji in 1997. As the center's founding director, Hau'ofa became the mentor for a whole generation of aspiring young artists, writers, dancers, and musicians from all parts of Oceania. Hau'ofa's call for Oceanian unity against continuing Euro-American imperialism, however, has not remained unchallenged. As the protracted struggles to establish educational and political institutions in Oceania have shown, forging unity across such a vast ocean remains a formidable challenge. Some scholars have charged Hau'ofa with downplaying long-standing cultural, political, and economic differences among Oceanian islands and their peoples. And Mele referred to tensions also within, between Melanesia and Polynesia, for example. In Papua New Guinea, for example, there's still quite a few people living in the highlands far away from the ocean. So Oceania seems to be quite far away from their life experiences. Conflicts among Samoans, Tongans, and Fijians, for example, reach back as far as the distant genealogical past, but continue to inform present-day interactions, including those taking place far away from the islands themselves. Hau'ofa's vision of a powerful sea of islands, other critics objected, amounted to little more than post-colonial utopianism and risked foundering on the shoals of self-interested realpolitik. Hau'ofa, for his part, treated such criticism with characteristic self-deprecation when he quipped, and I quote, "I've written very little, in fact, and the little that I've written has had no impact on anyone or anything." unquote. His self-belittlement revealed itself most clearly as the mask of a skilled artist when he wrote about the natural environment of the Pacific. For our author, the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean served as the basis for a common regional identity among Oceanians. In his essay, The Ocean in Us, 1997, he returned to his earlier argument in Our Sea of Islands, founding his vision of Oceanian unity on the common inheritance of the sea. And I quote from that essay: "An identity that is grounded in something as vast as the sea should exercise our minds and rekindle in us the spirit that sent our ancestors to explore the oceanic unknown and make it their home, our home," unquote. Reminding his audience of the courage of earlier generations, he called for solidarity among Oceanians to confront the challenges of an endangered natural environment that knows no post-colonial condition. Faced with rising water levels, deep sea mining, and droughts, many Pacific Islanders bear the brunt of climate change and environmental exploitation, mainly driven by the large economies that encircle the ocean. And Mele has already referred to that. Present developments, however, make clear have to be seen within the longer history of ecological imperialism in the Pacific. Then as now, the people living on the islands most affected by these environmental changes were rarely asked for their opinion. And that's changing, fortunately. Against this reality of disempowerment, he proposed a radical return to the natural environment that surrounds oceanic peoples. Our concluded his essay with these powerful words, quote, "The sea is the pathway to each other and to everyone else. The sea is our endless saga. The sea is our most powerful metaphor. The ocean is in us." Oceania's natural environment played a central role in Hau'ofa's personal life as well. Upon his return to Fiji in the early 1980s, he bought a farm in the hills of Lami and enjoyed the relative quiet of the countryside just outside Suva. And when this exuberant spirit ceased his lifelong wanderings across Oceania in 2009, his body found its final resting place in the womb of the land he served. So this is a bit of an overview of Hau'ofa's story. He was a model Oceanian intellectual who helped shape the region as well as various institutions, including the University of the South Pacific, which would become a model for regional cooperation and learning. So I wanted to speak a little bit about the USP in the remainder of my talk. Next slide, please. So this is the little bit lower quality map of the USP and its regional campuses. I hope you can discern at least the major member states. So the USP, the University of the South Pacific, was founded in 1968. It's only one of two regional universities in the world. The other one is the University of the West Indies in the Caribbean. It's made up of 14 campuses in 12 countries, and the countries are listed on that map. The main campus is in Suva in Fiji. It has produced generations of regional leaders and served as a crucible for pan-Pacific political movements for independence and democratization afterwards. I have plans to start a WPI Global Project Center in Fiji in the coming years. To expand our network of project centers in Oceania from Australia, New Zealand, and Hawaii to the Center of Polynesia in Fiji. We're still early on in this planning, but this is the USP is one of the organizations that I think WPI would be well positioned to collaborate with. There's actually recent news coming out of USP. I'm not sure how much you follow what's going on in Pacific Islands before this event. I'd recommend you keep up to date there. Last week, the USP Vice Chancellor, Paul Aluvalia, was forcibly deported from Fiji to Australia, to Brisbane, because he was involved in exposing financial mismanagement at the university. The Fijian authorities didn't, of course, say that officially. They said he's, violated some immigration laws and posed a threat to the peace of Fijian society. But it became increasingly clear that he's actually being punished for trying to unveil widespread corruption by former university administrators that are allied to the Prime Minister of Fiji. So the future of academic freedom and of USP also partly seems to be a little bit uncertain right now, but I hope these tensions will resolve themselves, and we can, WPI in the coming years at least, start a collaboration with USP. All right, finally, a few remarks on what I see as the future of the region. If you could go back to the second slide with the Pacific Islands, just to give you a sense again of the islands, one before this one, right? Thank you. So in terms of politics, the political cooperation among Pacific Island leaders has been ongoing since the 1960s and 70s and 80s, when many of the islands gained their independence. Some didn't, and it's already been mentioned by in the talk by Wole, our provost, non-sovereign territories, unincorporated territories. So the colonial past is not even past in the Pacific, in parts of the Pacific. The United States holds various unincorporated territories in the Pacific, also one incorporated territory. So the unincorporated territories are Guam, American Samoa, and then there are also freely associated countries like the Federated States of Micronesia and the Republic of the Marshall Islands and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands in Micronesia that are not technically colonies, but closely connected to the United States. And then I already mentioned New Caledonia and also French Polynesia are still French overseas departments. They are fully incorporated, really, French colonies in the Pacific. So that creates tension politically, because independent Pacific Island countries and the large players like Papua New Guinea and Fiji have to not only negotiate with leaders on the islands themselves, but also representatives of the metropolitan colonial governments in Washington, D.C. and in Paris. The Pacific Islands Forum is the major political institution that organizes among Pacific Islanders. And there was actually recent drama over the Pacific Islands Forum too. So I'm sorry to report some disturbing news recently. Just today or yesterday, after a marathon Zoom talk over the future leadership of the Pacific Islands Forum, 5 Micronesian countries left the forum in protest because their chosen candidate from Micronesia was passed over for a candidate from Polynesia, the former prime minister of the Cook Islands, associated with New Zealand. So they thought there was a so-called gentleman's agreement that there would be rotation among leadership within the 3 major cultural regions, Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia. But they felt betrayed, and now Micronesia is in protest, really, and the leaders have just left the Pacific Islands Forum. So this has just happened yesterday. So that's what's on the minds of a lot of Pacific Islander political leaders at the moment. In terms of economics, China looms large. I'm sure we'll talk more about the role of China in the Pacific in the rest of our event. Development projects financed by the Chinese state are expanding throughout the Pacific. They're connected to deep sea mining, to tourism, to agricultural exports. And they're increasingly replacing American or European development aid as Chinese development projects do also in other parts of the world. So the Pacific is part of this global clash of development states, China and versus the United States and Europe. So this will be something to keep in mind for the future. And since many of our students at the project centers are involved in these kinds of projects, this will be something to pay attention to. In terms of labor migration, this is an important revenue for many island economies, remittances from islanders who work in larger economies circling the Pacific, predominantly in Australia, New Zealand, as well as in the United States. And the COVID-19 pandemic has interrupted some of those labor migration flows. Workers are stuck in their destination countries, or they can't go to those destination countries to make money and work in agriculture and other sectors. So that has been really a problem for the income sources of many Pacific islands right now. And then finally, we'll talk more about the environment and climate change, I think, throughout our panel. So I want to keep that short. Finally, I just wanted to say a few words about culture. So I think the global awareness of Oceania is improving. I was heartened to see there's lots of information out there now, and more so, I think. And also representation in popular culture is improving. Mele mentioned the best rugby team in the world are the All Blacks of New Zealand. Music, dance, literature, including Mele's dad, Albert Wendt, and some of the younger Pacific writers in English, French, and in indigenous languages as well. And I think globally, the recent Disney movie Moana has also increased the awareness of Oceania and the Pacific Islands in other parts of the world. It's been quite a popular movie, like most Disney movies. This is a big machine, of course. But it also created pushback among Pacific Islanders over cultural stereotypes and the plastic pollution that the Disney Corporation and other entertainment corporations are actually contributing to the Pacific. All right. So in sum, the future of Oceania is beset with many challenges, as Mele has already mentioned. But if we heed the words by people like Epeli Hauofa and Mele Wendt, I think it remains bright. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Holger. So we have time for some questions.
We're running a little bit late, I think, but we still have, I think, a few minutes for questions, I hope. Yes, and I'm happy to address them.
We have some time. Yeah.
I have a question. Can I ask?
Sure.
So and this is a question for Holger, Mike, and the group as a whole. What do you see as the sort of grand challenge problems that can motivate our collaborations in Oceania in the next few years? And concretely, what are the things that WPI can do to support our efforts as we go into the next phase of our engagement of Oceania?
Mike, do you want to take that?
You go ahead, Holger.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I have my ideas. I mentioned, I think it would be great to expand our project centers in other parts of Oceania. I think Fiji would be an obvious choice. There's also other options. I think Mele would have been great to be here to sort of explain how that could actually work in the nitty-gritty and the institutional connections. The challenge is that, you know, as I mentioned, many of the islands are economically limited, and you know, many of the academics, scientists that you also mentioned in your introductory remarks, Wole, are based in New Zealand and Australia, and not so much on the islands themselves, the smaller islands. So this would be, I think, one of the questions we want to, you know, ask ourselves: to what extent WPI can collaborate and you know, level the playing field of exchange and collaboration with Pacific Islands and countries there, academics, scholars, and students. So this would be my 10 cents so far.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and I would agree. I mean, I think sea level rise is an existential threat to a number of these island countries. So I think that there's lots of ways in which we can partner with the countries of Oceania and be good stewards, be good listeners. I think we're doing that already, and we're very grateful to have the partners we have. And I see there's all kinds of grand challenges, you name it: water, power, So there's plenty to work on, and I think we bring that sort of cooperative approach, and we're good stewards, we're good listeners, and we're working to even get better at that. I think that's how I see it.
Great, thank you.
All right. So any other questions? One more question I think we have time for. Amy has a question. Do you want to read that out, Carrie, or do you want me to? Or...
That's entirely up to you, Mike.
Okay. All right. So this is on the chat. This is from Amy. This is to you, Holger. As science finds more artifacts, do you see the settlement of the region as fluid and open to newer versions of the migration story?
Yes, so this is an older map, and science and archaeologists are finding new pieces of evidence, as we speak. So I think this is sort of a gentle not question to say. There's also, recent findings that might correct the chronology and some of the errors on this map. That's the challenge of maps. They freeze history, but they also serve didactic functions, so you can actually see, where most of the migrations happened. Yeah, I would love to hear more from you also, like where do you see new findings, connected to Lapita culture and on the various islands that might revise some of the chronology, and also our understanding then of the connections between islands and their migration. So I think the map is sort of a rough draft from around, I think, 10, 15 years ago. And I'm looking forward to new maps that are even more up to date, maybe also a little bit more complicated to look at. This one at least had the advantage of showing, it's kind of the large swaths of migration. So I'm looking forward to the panel and your thoughts on this question as well.
Okay, great. So we should probably stop there. We have a 5-minute break right now, and we'll come back in 5 minutes. And thank you all. Thank you, Holger, very much, and Mele somewhere in Aotearoa. Probably, she's at a board meeting is where she is, so that's why she couldn't make it. Thank you.